I think we'll give it another minute. Just hit 50 and then we can get started. Okay, I think we're at a good number. I've got 50 participants, which is plenty. Hi, everyone. My name is Pam. For those of you who don't know me, I'm one of the senior staff scientists with the ClinGen Bro team, and I'll be running the meeting with Kezang, recording and helping behind the scenes as well on behalf of Marina and Alicia, as they're both having fabulous holidays this week. So I'm here in their place. So the plan today is to go through the variant curation documents on behalf of the variant curation proxies. So Deb and I will be tackling that together. And then in terms of general announcements, for the next meeting at the end of this month, the plan will be to have a presentation from the Curated Disease Entity Working Group. And I believe they'll be their first official introduction to this group. Okay, I think you can stop sharing Kezang unless there's anything else you can think of. Great, I will share my screen. Okay, so you should all be able to see the slideshow with Variant Curation Document Update as the title. If you can't see that, please let me know. The plan for today is for Deb to go through the VCEP protocol and some updates that have been done there over the last few months. I will tackle discussing the standardized text for ClinGen VCEPs and updates on that front, and then quickly provide an update on the C-spec and integration of points for anyone on this call who isn't aware of that. So with the top two documents, the plan is for these documents to be available on the website shortly. So as a FYI, we're giving you a sneak preview, but these changes aren't officially live yet. So if you were to go on the website, you'll still see the old version. Once they are ready, we will let the Biocurator working group listserv know, and then you can go and bookmark them on your tab on your end. And then our next big plan, and this has been in the works for a little while now and quite overdue, is the Variant Curation SOP and providing a big update for that as well, which should be exciting. So Deb, I'll hand it over to you to present the VCEP protocol updates for us.
Great. And do you want me to share slides or do you want to just click through them?
I'm happy to click through them if you're okay with that.
Yeah, that's fine. So we can go to the next one. All right, so one of the first items that will be changing all throughout the documentation, but really also just in general for everyone to know, is that we are changing some of the structural organization of some of the working groups. So the sequence variant interpretation working group is going to be renamed, and we have an image that shows it on the next page, but it'll be renamed to Variant Classification Working Group. And then the Variant Curation Working Group is renamed to the Variant Curation Expert Panel Management Working Group. And the SVI Review Committee is now the Variant Curation Expert Panel Review Committee. So this is just, so again, it's a large change. We have to change it throughout a lot of resources, but in this new version coming out, when you're searching for that, if you've just gone through it and searched like SVI, you'll need to search for Variant Classification Working Group, or VCWG, in the document. So if you go to the next slide, it has some more details and an overview of the upcoming changes. So the Variant Classification Working Group It has the co-chairs listed and the manager listed for it as well. And then there's multiple subgroups underneath the variant classification working group. So there is the AVE and ClinGen functional working group. There's the computational working group. And it notes there that the call for members for that working group is still open. There's the GenCC mechanism working group, low penetrance risk allele working group, pseudo deficiency working group, and splicing working group. And again, note that there is a call for members and co-chair open for the splicing working group. That working group, oh, the call for members closed on June 2nd. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. Thank you, Danielle. So then on the right-hand side, you can see too that the variant classification working group will be working closely with the ACMG AMP-CAP ClinGen sequence variant classification committee and also with the C&V classification committee. And then on the left-hand side, you can see that this is split out into three different subgroups here: the VCEP management working group, the management core group, and then the VCEP review committee as well. So just, this is kind of a large organizational change, and just for everyone to be aware of that, we'll also be talking about it on, I'm sure, on a coordinator's call as well. And we can go to the next slide. So this is just to highlight a couple of the major changes coming up with the VCEP protocol. I will say that all throughout the VCEP protocol, there are minor changes around there, but these are just highlighting some of the larger changes that we have. One of those is clarification around the review of pilot variants. So in this, we've clarified the number of pilot variants has stayed the same, but we've clarified mainly that when the specifications are accepted and when the VCEP is step 4 approved, that is the date in which you need to select for the pilot variant curation, so that all pilot variants essentially must be curated on those final specifications, so that your approval date for that variant is not prior to the date at which the VCEP is approved as an expert panel. So again, this is also, it's partly Biocurator, but it's also partly coordinator to be able to check those kind of final dates in the VCI as well. But that's a change to point out here, is that we really need to make sure that all of those are the dates are after the approval date for the VCEP. And if we can go to the next slide. So another change that we've made is to add information about selecting the transcript and about choosing the mode of inheritance. So we've added in some text here about specifying the mode of inheritance, and as well about choosing the main select transcript and giving guidance on who to contact if there is an issue with the main select transcript. And if we can go to the next one. And the next section is adding in information about approving variants and then submitting those to the e-repo. So there have been some cases where some variants have been approved and submitted, but the submission to the e-repo is a separate step or a separate button that needs to be clicked to make sure that it's published to the e-repo. So we've added in that information as well about making sure that after the variants are approved, they're submitted to the e-repo and also submitted to ClinVar. I think that's it on some of the major changes in the VCEP protocol, but again, all throughout there will be some changes to look for, and especially changes on the naming of these groups as well for being able to search within those documents is important to know. And I'll hand it over to you, Pam.
Okay, thank you, Deb. So now I'll start talking about the standardized text that is used for evidence summaries for variant curations. So I just included a screenshot here just for anyone who's newer to ClinGen or perhaps is part of a VCEP where you haven't gotten to the stage yet of actually writing up evidence summaries for your variant curations, whether it's because you're still in your specification stage. But there is on the website a couple of spots. This documents and announcements is just one area where you can get this text document that essentially provides a template that ClinGen VCEPs are strongly encouraged to use to ensure that we have standardized and harmonized evidence summaries across all our expert panels as we are FDA recognized. And so just very briefly, as I mentioned, this document contains summary text. It's quite long because it describes all the different evidence codes and the data that's used for variant classification, and provides different essential little templates for how to summarize each evidence code based on whether it's met, not met, or the strength has changed. So as I mentioned, this is required because of our FDA status and helps with clarity and transparency with our evidence summaries, especially because they are submitted to ClinVar and anyone around the world is able to look up our variants and see what we've written as the rationale behind the curation. So it is a little bit outdated. The most current version is from January 2022, so it's definitely a long overdue update. And this evidence summary appears in a couple of places. So the Biocurator is responsible for adding it into the VCI as they add their variant curation. And then this appears in the eRepo that Deb had mentioned before, the ClinGen Evidence Repository, and then also in ClinVar. And so I just wanted to show here a screenshot of what that structured evidence summary can look like in ClinVar under the comment. So this is a curation done by the ClinGen Congenital Myopathies VCEP. And then there's also a link out to the eRepo, which has a more structured format of each of the different evidence codes that were utilized and why. Okay, thank you, Danielle, for putting that in the chat. So in terms of the high-level changes that have been made, and similar to the VCEP protocol, this is just kind of touching on the more major changes, but there's minor changes throughout as well. So things like this figure that I'll discuss shortly, but Nomad text updates, any SVI specifications that have come out since that we should integrate into the standardized text, language about internal data and PHI, removing the approval date at the end of the evidence summary due to typos, or risk of typos, I should say, guidance on the Tevtesian points system, using language around low penetrance variants, and how to describe recurations. So one of the things that is in the current version is just showing in the VCI parts of it where you can add in, so the section here, we can add an explanation for each evidence code that has been assessed and why. So it defaults to not evaluated. And so if it's met or not met, or the strength has changed, there should be an explanation so that we have that transparency as to why the curation has been done that way and the evidence supporting it. And then in that final summary page is the section to put in the evidence summary, which is approved by the VCEP. And if there's any modifications from the classification that's auto-classified, for example, if it's auto-classified as a VUS, but the group is classifying it as likely pathogenic because, for example, very strong plus a supporting using a point system gets you to a likely pathogenic to explain the rationale behind it in here. So we'll just update this figure to show some examples in each of these boxes to illustrate what we mean when we say all of this should be filled in if applicable. So in terms of Nomad, as we all know now, there's been that huge upgrade to the database with using Nomad v4.1. And we've just updated the language a little bit around that. So in this example here of BA1, so in red is the additional text where there's this optional section to specify whether the allele frequency is based off the exomes data, genomes data, or the combined total. And then adding group max filtering allele frequency to represent what it's now called in Nomad v4.1. And then also just change it just from population to genetic ancestry group to be a little bit more accurate. And then, just as a FYI, I'm sure everyone here knows this already, but if not, that Nomad v4.1 is now live in the VCI. So you don't have to go into Nomad anymore to get that information. You can now go directly through the VCI and get the group max filtering allele frequency and the individual frequency allele information for the genetic ancestry groups. So another update now, looking at publications that have come out in the last few years, is the Ajuyah et al. Paper, which is referencing PP3 and BP4, so the meta predictors, and testing them at various strengths. So it's just a figure partially of the table, showing a few of those tools and the evidence supporting that they can be used at strengths beyond supporting, and what would be the recommend cutoffs based on that. And so knowing that that's something that some VCEPs have now started integrating into their specifications, if you are curating for a VCEP that has done so, we've just added this option here as a reminder to when writing up the evidence summary and describing the PP3 or BP4, and you're using it at a strength other than supporting to indicate the strength. And just as an aside comment, that if you are using PP3 strong together with PM1, to just be cautious and to refer to the recommendations from Ajuyah et al. And to consult with the appropriate VCEP regarding the use of these combinations. But again, VCEPs would have gone into the deep dive to determine this. So I guess it's really more for those curating out in the wild. And then we've got PS1 and the integration this is from a Walker et al. Paper from, I think, a couple of years ago now, which had discussed repurposing PS1 so that it's not just for missense variants, but you can also use it for splicing variants. And this is just showing a little bit of a snapshot from that table illustrating that. And so if you are using PS1 for splicing, the bits in red just describe the sections where you would indicate that. And what I also wanted to highlight in here is that if you are using a comparison variant from ClinVar, to please include the VCV, which is the ID for the variant record. Okay, and so with points, because we know that some VCEPs are using points, some VCEPs are not, but for those that are using points within their classifications or for certain codes, to make that very clear in the evidence summary. So for each part of the evidence summary where you are, so for example, if you're using it for proband counting, PS4, PM3, to provide the points, but then to also have a final summary of points at the end of the evidence summary. So to just make that distinction clear. And then this is just showing an example, and all of this is in the evidence summary doc update, but just really making it clear that you say, based on PMID, whatever it is that you're using, what the points applied would be. And then again, stating at the end the total amount of PMIDs and what the total amount of points would be, which equates to a classification of XX. So just trying to add a bit more clarity with how we're describing points within the evidence summaries. And so to ensure consistency for all the ClinGen VCEPs, to use this as much as possible to standardize text document to describe this kind of information, and that if anything is modified due to the use of points, to, as I mentioned before, provide that reason in the modification section of the VCI. So with the low penetrance language, and this is something that really Deb's been leading and discussing this with various VCEPs to kind of get a consensus, and also with the low penetrance and risk allele working group to come up with some sort of standardized text for VCEPs that are dealing with low penetrance variants, because there's a little bit of inconsistency at the moment as to how groups are dealing with that. And so there's a bit of guidance that has come out. There's the Smith et al. 2024 papers, figure 1, and then also a white paper from earlier this year as well that is on the ClinGen website. And so the recommendation at the moment is for ClinGen VCEPs to use the language of low penetrance, moderate penetrance, or atypical penetrance, instead of other terms such as reduced or incomplete penetrance. And so again, to ensure there's like some consistency between our VCEPs, towards the end of this evidence summary text, provide a brief statement with references to justify why it's been designated this way, and then in red as an example. So, for example, based on whatever references there are, this variant has been classified as the classification, whether it's low, moderate, or typical penetrance, and to very importantly say it's relative to the typical pathogenic variant in the gene, and to provide your rationale. And then here's just a couple of reasons as to what the rationale can be. For example, is the phenotype different? For example, is it less aggressive or partial? Does it exceed typical population cutoffs? But there's significant evidence of the pathogenicity of the variant. So to just really explain that rationale. Before I move on to the next slide, I'll just pause for a second to see, Deb, if there's anything else you wanted to add to this, because you really led the charge on this.
No, just making sure to be aware that the low penetrance risk allele working group is still in the process of coming out with kind of their official recommendations for this. So this is basically a placeholder until that happens. And it's really only for those groups that are dealing with kind of established gene disease pairs that then have a low penetrance variant or two in there. I don't think that any of this is intended for genes themselves where there is where the gene disease relationship is not, either not well established, or that the gene itself seems to be like a kind of a low penetrance gene in general. So I do think this is meant for kind of if I'm making sense saying this, I hope so. It's intended for those cases where there are a few variants within a gene that have been recognized as low penetrance. And again, though, I do want to emphasize this is basically a placeholder for something that's coming out, and we'll keep you updated on that through the low penetrance and risk allele working group.
Okay, right. Okay, I can see Mariana has made a comment in the chat, just thanking you, Deb, for that. And I think the only thing I'll just add on top of that as well, carrying on from what Deb said as well, this is as she said, it's not for those genes that have like low evidence or low penetrance. Like VCEP should not be working on those type of genes. They should only be working on genes that have definitive, strong evidence, or at worst moderate for the gene disease relationship. So it's very clear, strong associations for the gene disease. So a note about PHI, protected health information, and it's in red and capitalized. So it's very important to know that PHI is absolutely not allowed in the VCI and for us to publish onto ClinVar. So there's no reason or no circumstances where that would be acceptable. If you're uncertain about what kind of data falls under PHI, to familiarize yourself. Also, can consult with experts in your group or with the Data Access Protection and Confidentiality Working Group of ClinGen. And this is their email address here, if uncertain. But there is a prompt that you will get when you're entering the variant into the VCI. Before you can start your curation, it will say, number one, that the data that is in the VCI will be made publicly accessible. So to be aware of that. Number two, that it is important that the unpublished patient-specific data has enough minimum information to be useful, but that it shouldn't have any identifiable or PHI information in there before, and then you just need to agree to that before you can proceed. So just a reminder again. And then continuing on the note of internal data and describing that, because that's another point of slight inconsistency between groups. And so we thought what would be helpful, we'll just give a couple of ways to describe this type of internal data. So whether it's from like a personal communication or lab, or if it's from a ClinVer submitter, so you've reached out to them and they've provided more information about the case, to provide the details of the case first, and then in brackets, kind of clearly stipulate the source of that information. And if there's multiple sources, you can list all of those if applicable. If it is from ClinVer, it's actually really helpful if you can include the SCV. So I've just, again, included a screenshot from ClinVer and just showing here under the submitter and the session, this you can see the SCV and then a unique identifier. So that's more helpful than putting in, for example, the VCV, which is the ID for the variant record as a whole. Whereas the SCV ties it to a specific submission. So if you've gotten more information from a specific submitter, it's quite helpful it's more helpful to tie it to that SCV ID. Okay, and so then another thing that has changed. So in the past, the suggestion was to include the date of variant approval in the evidence summary. However, due to risk of kind of any typos, we want to try and minimize that. This should actually not be included anymore in the evidence summary, as it's somewhat redundant because the approval date is actually displayed in the evidence repository. And so you can just look at that if you want to have that information of when the variant was approved. And it's just important when you're approving it to just choose that date carefully. Okay. And then another note is with recurations. And so another thing is to not actually specify in the evidence summary whether or not this variant was done as a recuration and the reasons why. Because this will actually be reflected in the versioning and versioning history in the e-repo. So when you're in the evidence repository, you've clicked on a variant, you can actually scroll down to the bottom and it has a section here called Curation History. And so you can see for this variant, there's 2 rows for it. And if you look at the published date, this is your indication. So it will show that this was initially published 2019 and then a few years later in 2023, and it has a versioning number as well. So that's really a great way to see if a variant has been recurated or not. So that's the high-level overview that Deb and I have provided for those 2 documents. If you have, along the way, while you're using those documents, have had any other kind of pain points or thoughts for improvement, please feel free to send it our way, whether you want to put it in the chat now and we can collect it, or you want to email variantcuration@clinicalgenome.org. I will note that we are planning to have this on the website soon, but it's not live yet. So we're still very open to any other areas that anyone on this call thinks is relevant for us to look into. Okay, I might pause for a second to see if there's any questions of what we've shown so far before I move on to the C-spec update. No? Okay. It's pretty standard stuff, I suppose. So then the last little bit is just for those who may not be aware yet, but the C-spec now has an update where it has two options now. So previously, the way it was set up was for Richards et al. 2015 combining rules. So, one very strong plus one supporting equals this, one, three strong plus however many moderates equals that. Very hard to memorize, as we know. And so it now has integration with the Taftijan et al. Point system, where VCEP can choose to specify based on points and have this embedded within the C-spec. So this is done very much at the VCEP level, and the coordinator is responsible for submitting the specification and choosing that whichever system they want to follow, and tailoring it accordingly into the C-spec. But this is obviously important for curators who may be looking at the C-spec and start to see some differences. So just flagging that that's a change that you may see shortly with any VCEPs that move their specifications into the point system officially. And to get a sense of what this will look like, so this is just a test that Neethu sent over, but it'll show, for example, what the default points value will be for that specification, for that evidence code at that strength. So again, showing the difference where it's very points focused. And then a very big difference being that final section at the bottom, where instead of a combination of codes, I'll have points ranges and what they equate to in terms of the variant classification, with options to slightly edit the VUS and likely benign point ranges. So one important thing to note, or I suppose there's two, is that this point system isn't the V4 point system coming. It's kind of a placeholder until we get to that point. And then the other thing to note is that this feature is live only in a C-spec and not in the VCI. And so if you add a variant into the VCI, it's still based on the 2015 evidence codes. And so any points would have to be manually described. Okay, that was my last slide. So any questions on that or anything else? Otherwise, I think. Okay. If not, and you're always welcome, as I said, I showed the email address earlier for the Variant Curation group to send any follow-up questions, thoughts to that email address. So I'll let everyone get some time back in their day and finish up there. Goodbye.